morning, everybody. I've been given this tiny little topic of the hazards and risks in the current world to analyse and fully inform you of in 10 to 15 minutes. So clearly I've put some definitions around that. But first of all, can I just thank you all for coming this morning and also introduce the Hugo Group. So we have 110 of New Zealand's significant companies, and we provide the political, economic and regulatory insights that they need to do their jobs well. I've chosen not to cover social aspects of this topic. Other speakers in this session will cover climate change, the environment and health. And personally, I think that probably the social issues are some of the most challenging, and I want to touch on one at the end. But rather, I've chosen to frame my comments under 4 headings. The first are the economic hazards and risks that New Zealand faces. The second is technology. The third is the geopolitical world that we live in. And the fourth one I'll just touch on briefly given time is trust and how that's changing and evolving in this current environment. But before exploring these, and given the potentially alarming subject matter of both of your conference and of this session, I did want to make the point that out of adversity comes innovation, and that human beings over the millennia have proved to be very resilient species. So although in researching this I kind of got increasingly depressed, at the end of the day we do know that people will find solutions and outcomes as they move forward. Economic hazards and risks. Well, the New Zealand economy continues to perform reasonably well in an international standard, and the growth numbers are credible on a national scale. But this is not translating down to improved personal economic wealth for many. However, and this widening divide is a key social risk for New Zealand and the rest, and also a bunch of other countries in the rest of the world. And I think that debate is becoming increasingly prevalent in the Auckland housing debate, where people are feeling shut out of what many see as a right to own their own home. And while New Zealand may be doing okay, the global economy is in uncharted and sluggish waters. Global growth forecasts have been subject to regular downward revision over the last 12 to 18 months, and almost 8 years after the global financial crisis, policymakers around the world still face enormous challenges in stimulating investment and reviving global growth. The world economy has been held back by several major headwinds: persistent macroeconomic uncertainties and volatility, low commodities and declining prices and declining trade flows, rising volatility in exchange rates and capital flows, and a continued disconnect between the finance and the real sector activities. I was privileged to hear Alan Bollard speak recently, who is the director of APEC, where he's based in Singapore, talking about 60% less traffic going through the Singapore port in the last 12 months. So the ultimate consequences of the scale of money pumped into the economies of the world by governance through the GFC is still unknown. I love it with economists. I work with Arthur Grimes and a few others who the traditional way of thinking about these things just isn't planning out. And the post-GFC panacea of Chinese growth can no longer be relied on, and while central banks increasingly bear responsibility for reviving the world's major economies. And I wanted to make just give a quote here from Time magazine, because I thought it was the best one that I read and I wasn't going to be able to put it any better. It's called The China Footprint. Never has a country at China's modest level of economic and political development left such a vast footprint. It is the only country of scale today with a real global economic strategy. The recognition in 2016 that China is both the most important and most uncertain driver of a series of global outcomes will increasingly unnerve other international players who aren't ready for it, don't understand or agree with Chinese priorities, and won't know how to respond to the challenge. So high structural unemployment and underemployment are becoming embedded features of European and other key cities, and governments are balking at unpopular structural reforms that are building up colossal stocks of new debt in the process. So New Zealand is a trading nation, and tourism is the largest earner of foreign exchange, and China is our second largest trading partner. So the economic risk to New Zealand in the current world is an uncertain and international global economy. Second heading I wanted to talk to is technology. And this is a huge topic in itself, and there's bookshelves and bookshops filled up with this and screeds on the internet. But I want to focus my 2 minutes on this topic in two aspects, and then I snuck in a little third one that I'll get to as well. Klaus Schwab, who was widely quoted from at the moment, is the founder of the World Economic Forum, and he's written about a thing he's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and that we stand at the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. In its scale and complexity, the transformation will be like anything mankind has experienced. There are three reasons for this: velocity, scope, and the system's impact. The speed of the current breakthroughs has no historical precedent. Its implications for every aspect of society, political, social, economic, corporate, and even for family will be profound. These are big words, and even if you don't regard them as extreme, which I don't, we're up for massive change. This means extraordinary opportunity and also significant risk. Whole job types will disappear and social dislocation will occur. And yes, new jobs will be created, but transitioning is not often possible, and not everyone will be a winner, contributing to the social divides New Zealand will face. The second aspect of risk under this technology heading I want to reference is cybercrime. And crimes in cyberspace cost the global economy an estimated US $445 billion last year, higher than many economies' national incomes. New Zealand is far from immune, and indeed as an affluent country is a target with increasing levels of attack. So attacks are categorised under 6 categories, and ours are increasing rapidly. The government has had to support major companies as they dealt with attacks costing many millions of dollars. And I do know of one which the Prime Minister speaks of, which took place 2 years ago, where one of our significant New Zealand companies, the government had to walk in and support them. They were under cyber attack. Their systems were all shut down. They couldn't access their financial records. It cost them in the end around $250 million, and that was without the government charging for the support it provided to put the security in place. Ransomware, so that's malicious software that will encrypt all your documents and require a ransom to be paid before you can get the key to decrypt it, is readily downloadable on the dark web. At the Hugo Group CEO retreat last year, we had a chap speak to it who was previously the head of the cybercrime strategy in the UK. And that was a pretty chilling presentation, I have to say. But the one thing that stuck in my mind is an example he gave of London traders who were made redundant, and the going rate for them unencrypting their key data was £60,000, and that was common across the sector. Increasingly, risk and cost to business and individuals, insurance products are being developed, but the impact can be catastrophic, and we've all seen Sony and some of the major cybercrimes that have happened internationally, but it is a real issue for New Zealand. The third one I just kind of added in, I denied about and did choose to add in, was actually around teenage narcissism. And I was speaking to, in another role, a professor of psychology up at Massey University up in Auckland, who talked about the fact that human beings are very reliant on body language, and it's a skill that you learn from interacting from birth, and that the interaction with social media precludes any need for for body language and understanding how people relate. It's a fundamental and very deep part in our brains, and they're actually mapping this lack of development in the brain as kids engage more and more on social media and less face-to-face. So in the US, they have set up a series of camps where kids are sent away for 2 weeks with no technology to actually learn to relate as human beings. And I think that's a kind of scary risk all by itself. The last one in my cheerful list of risk is geopolitical risks. So and that's important for New Zealand because we live in the big wide world. So the Transatlantic Partnership, we're a trading nation, has been the world's most important alliance for nearly 70 years, but it's now weaker and has less relevance than at any point in decades. The US no longer plays a decisive role in addressing any of Europe's top priorities. Russia's continuing intervention in the Ukraine and the conflict in Syria will expose transatlantic divisions. As the US and European paths diverge, there will be no one to play international firefighter, and global conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, will be left to rage. And the United Nations, I think it's fair to say, have proved to be pretty ineffective in dealing with these. For half a century, the US has been the world's biggest superpower, but China's been catching up fast and is by some measures the largest economy on earth, and is pursuing provocative expansion in its sphere of military influence. So while emerging economies are no longer growing as fast as they were, the fact remains that 4 of the world's largest, 10 fastest growing cities are in Turkey, 4 are in China, and none are in the US or traditional Europe. This year, Asia Pacific will have a larger middle class than Europe and North America combined. So Europe is experiencing powerful stresses in the Eurozone: the refugee crisis, the war in Ukraine and Syria, and the rise of both the radical right and left-wing political movements in response to sharply rising income and social inequality. The instability of global oil prices, ISIS, and the ambitions of the Russian president add to a nasty set of problems. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump. So New Zealand must learn to trade and dwell in a volatile world, and once again, that creates opportunities and it creates risk. The fourth topic I want to speak to briefly is trust. And a public relations company called Edelman do a global survey. They've done it for 16 years. For the first time, they've done it in New Zealand this year as well, but it's got no background references. But the relationships in which mature societies function are changing, not least in attitudes to traditionally trusted sources. So while global research indicates businesses remain relatively better trusted than governments or media, consumers and stakeholders are bombarded with negative messages that undermine the trusted status that businesses seek as a core element of their corporate reputation and integrity, with direct flow through to brand value. And yet trust can only be earned and not bought. And I made the comment to a panel member, which I think is true. Johnny's pug, Freddie, and his comments on issues seem to be as important a reference for people for information as perhaps the news at 6 o'clock. And people are finding different sources of trust, and the intelligentsia that previously led debates and discussions are no longer regarded as necessarily the source of information for many people. So I think on that equally depressing note, I will finish my wrap-up, but I would like to say, as I said at the beginning, all of these creates innovation and opportunities for New Zealand and the world. We have increasing numbers of high net worth New Zealanders, overseas people coming to buy property in New Zealand to escape the global pressures I've just spoken about. We have high levels of tourism, but we have increasing social divides, and I think that remains our major risk. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. That stuff does seem a million miles away when you hear Jo talking about it, but when you start converting it into what it means for us in our local setting, it is actually very relevant. And for us in Wellington, for example, we know that it's really hard to find a native Wellingtonian. Most of the people who work in Wellington actually come from outside Wellington for sure, and outside New Zealand in many cases. And if you combine that with the fact that about half of Wellingtonians work in the area of knowledge-intensive economy, where they are really reliant on technology and telecommunications in particular to perform their economic function, that's a pretty heady cocktail if something were to go wrong and those things were no longer to be available in Wellington. We worry that Wellington would be, or we joke about it, but Wellington would become the Picton of the North Island, with the greatest respect to anybody from Picton. So those are the sorts of things that we worry about. And if you think about a cyber attack, for example, with a half of our economy reliant on telecommunications, then all of a sudden that's a pretty... that's something that's worth thinking about. Pretty depressing, but our job is to think about depressing stuff. Which is a nice segue into our next speaker. Again, in Wellington, we know that we've got some work to do around resilience. We need to spend a few $1 billion actually to get us to where we need to be. But if we don't do that and we have a shake, we know that we'll lose GDP of more than $10 million per year for a number of years. So in terms of investment, it makes sense for us to do that kind of stuff. But increasingly, we're having to think about the economic impact of shocks. and what that means for us in terms of recovery. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Nick Horspool from GNS, who's going to speak with us about exactly that. Thanks, Nick. Cheers.
So I hope Mike was referring to the subject of my talk, not me, when he was referring to depressing coming up next. What I'd like to talk about today is some nationally significant natural hazard events, the top 6 that we think could threaten New Zealand's economic future. So these are really disruptive events that could cause not only local impacts, but disruption to regions or New Zealand as a whole. And so I'm going to go through a bit of a disaster speed dating, profiling some of these events. And it's really setting a challenge for the emergency management field to think about these events in the planning horizons that we're working on 50 years and onwards, and how we can incorporate building resilience into mitigating some of these events. Now, while I may be the person speaking here, this is actually a culmination of over 100 years of science and engineering from people across New Zealand and internationally that is fed into this information. So this is really capturing bits of work that's been done previously and consolidating it into a profile. So Donald Rumsfeld and black swans, what do they mean? Well, they're actually a really good reference point for the type of challenge that we're dealing with when we think about natural hazards. They're infrequent and high impact, and there's a lot of unknowns. Now, Donald Rumsfeld, referring to the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, came up with a really wordy quote around known knowns and unknown knowns. And what that hits at is that when we have information and planning for something, we know things that we know about, and that might be something that we've experienced in the past. We have information on that. But for natural hazards, we often know that something's going to happen, but we don't know how that's going to be manifest, and that's our known unknowns. And then the black swan is the really scary stuff. That's the unknown unknowns. And so that's really where we don't even know something's going to happen, and it impacts in a way that we couldn't imagine. So things like the 9/11 or the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami are our black swan events. But from a science perspective and emergency management, our known knowns are our past events, our frequent events that we've experienced, and our known unknowns are the things that we can model with science, and that's what I'll be talking about today. So we can do this using risk modelling tools such as Riskscape or the Merit tool from the Economics of Resilient Infrastructure project. And what these tools do is they combine information on the hazard, so the severity, the intensity, with elements of society that are of interest. So this could be people, buildings, lifelines, or the environment. And then we study how those elements of society may respond to that given hazard, and we can come up with direct impact, damage, direct losses in dollar terms, downtime or business disruption, and casualties, and then translate that into downstream economic effects that may impact society. Now, we can do this for lifelines, agriculture, different sectors as well through tools such as Riskscape. So a lot of the work that's going to be presented here is the science feeding into these tools to give us some type of quantitative information on the potential impacts. Now, I must say that the numbers that you're going to see there is a lot of uncertainty in these models, so they shouldn't be taken to the third decimal place, but provide an order of magnitude that we could expect from some of these events. So our first disaster that I want to introduce is an alpine fold earthquake, magnitude 8 or greater. We all know that the alpine fold is one of the biggest faults that we have running through New Zealand. It runs from Fiordland through up to nearly the top of the South Island. And this event has a very high likelihood of occurring in natural hazards terms. It's about a 30% chance in the next 50 years. Putting that in context to lotto, if you bought a lotto ticket every week for the next 50 years, your chance of winning would be 0.07%. So this is an event that, in geologic terms, we would consider quite likely. Now, the South Island west coast isn't home to any of our large cities, but there would be significant direct losses to buildings and infrastructure. And many buildings across the South Island would be impacted and probably have damage to some level. But probably one of the biggest impacts from this event is the disruption to our lifelines. So this is some work from Tom Robinson at University of Canterbury, showing the dots where potential failures in the roading network would occur following landslides generated or fault rupture from this event. And as you can see, many of our communities on the west coast would be isolated. There'd be widespread outages of critical lifelines such as water, sewage and electricity. And there's a big question around the performance of of the electricity generation in the South Island and distribution to places like the North Island. So how this would fare. And this is probably an area for future research. Next off the rank is climate change and sea level rise. So some fantastic work done by Rob Bell and his colleagues at NIWA have assessed the exposure of New Zealand infrastructure to possible sea level rises. And the problem with sea level rise is that the sea level increases, but any coastal hazards that come on top of that, such as storm tides or tsunamis, then add extra compounding losses to that. And so Rob worked out that there's about nearly $20 billion of building value alone in areas that may be impacted by these storm tides on a regular basis every year in the next 50 years. And there's a lot of infrastructure in New Zealand as well. There's 380 critical infrastructure buildings, 1,500 wharfs or jetties that are important to local communities and for exporting trade, and over 2,000 kilometres of road that provide that pathway, how we interact between communities. And probably of concern the most, there'll be 500,000 people whose homes will be in these areas that are likely going to be inundated on a regular basis. Now, I think a really salient point here is that only a 30 to 40 centimetre sea level rise will make that 1 in 100-year event that we experience a yearly event. So this is something that's the frequency of impacting events are going to increase a lot more through climate change and sea level rise. And this is something that's happening right now, but it's slow. It's not as disruptive immediately as an earthquake or something, but it's something that's going to creep up on us if we don't plan for it now. Auckland, 50 volcanoes are spread across the Auckland volcanic field. They provide great places to build your house and have views, or you may have a lava flow going through your garage like Sir Ray talked about. But there's a real risk of a volcanic eruption in the next 50 years, 5%. The last one was 400 to 500 years ago, Rangitoto Island, which provides the beautiful backdrop for the Hauraki Gulf. If this event occurred in Auckland, we've modelled a scenario which was done for a planning exercise for the Earthquake Commission, as well as looking at lifeline disruption. And this is called Exercise Ruamoko. And it occurred in the Mangere Harbour. And this event alone, which is probably not the worst impacting event for Auckland, the worst one would be probably in the eastern suburbs or near the CBD, would cause about $24 billion of direct losses to buildings and infrastructure. And most of this would be totally destroyed and would not be able to be rebuilt in the short term. Some areas would be without lifelines for over a year, as there's disruption to the electricity network from ash deposits, or ash flowing into stormwater systems and blocking drains, causing possible follow-on flooding. Over 200,000 people may be displaced because of exclusion zones around the area where the eruption is occurring, and 40,000 businesses could be displaced. So this could cause really significant impact and disruption to the Auckland economy, which, because it's such a big part of New Zealand, has a flow-on effect and could lead to about 15% reduction in New Zealand GDP and employment. Now, this is an event that could actually occur over a long time scale, so it's not just happening in a day or a week and stopping. It could occur over months or years. What we may not know is that we have the largest fault in New Zealand actually lies offshore from us, the Hikurangi megathrust. And the black box shows roughly the area of this fault. So it's not a vertical fault like the Alpine fault. It actually dips slowly beneath the North Island. It's actually about 20 kilometres beneath us here in Wellington. So we might be able to see the Wellington fault running along the motorway, being the big threat. Well, this is probably just as equal threat to Wellington as well. And an event like this would cause shaking on the order of what was observed in lots of parts of Christchurch for much of the East Coast. So Wellington, Napier, Gisborne, and so forth. And this and the subsequent tsunami and landslides generated is probably the biggest direct economic loss causing event that we may expect in the next 50 years. If it's more to the 9, like was observed in Japan, the consequences are going to be more on the order of $40 billion, but it could be as low as 8 or so. There'd be widespread liquefaction and landslides that would cause disruption to lifelines for many communities across the North Island. We'd have shaking in Auckland that hasn't been felt before by Aucklanders, and we know what happened when there was the magnitude 3 near Auckland. Imagine if this happened, we'd hear all about it. And one of the big challenges that we didn't experience in Christchurch is mass displacement and resettlement of people. There'd be coastal zones, like the photo shown in Japan, where the communities are being totally wiped out. There's no buildings, there's no infrastructure. Even buildings that have been partially destroyed, people won't be able to live in them like we lived in Christchurch. And so this poses a challenge for New Zealand, is how we would house these people, where would they go? Back to volcanic eruptions. Most of us have, saw the photos from 1995-96 of Ruapehu. That was a very small eruption in the scheme of what Ruapehu or Mount Taranaki can generate. And an event like this could last for months, and it wouldn't cause a huge amount of disruption around the volcanoes, because there's not a lot of people living there. But what it would cause is widespread disruption to road travel. There'd be reduced visibility from ashfall. Roads become slippery with ash, so travel times would increase. Air travel would be disrupted. If there was a Central North Island eruption, planes would have to divert round the ash cloud, increasing travel costs for airlines, which would then pass it on to consumers. About 5 millimetres of ash, which is the orange bar, would cause disruption to primary sectors. So that's where agriculture, the plants, the animals become to get disrupted by the ash, and production would reduce. How that would impact dairy prices and the New Zealand dollar, that hasn't been modelled yet. And last on our list is probably a big unknown, but something we've lived through before, and that's an earthquake sequence. So this is where we have multiple earthquakes within a short period of time that may impact many areas. In the past, we had a sequence in 1850-ish where we had a number of large earthquakes in a short period of time through New Zealand. In 1929 to 1942, we had over 7 earthquakes in 13 years that were above magnitude 7. Now that occurred in some rural areas, but if those were pieced together and impacting multiple centres, we could expect quite significant direct losses and disruption to multiple regions over a period of time. What the sequence may look like in the future is unknown, but we could argue that we may be in one of these at the moment, with the large Fiordland earthquake in 2009, the Canterbury earthquake sequence, and the recent Cook Strait earthquakes. So those are the disasters that we think, the big ticket items that we should be planning for in the next 50 years that have a high enough likelihood of occurring. Mike mentioned the Wellington fault. We've done a lot of work on the Wellington fault. This is trying to really highlight some thinking outside of the knowns to what we may expect in the future. In the short term, I think there's some really big challenges. One is, if we have another significant earthquake that causes high direct losses, the Crown's exposure to these losses is quite high at the moment. The reason for this is the National Disaster Fund, which covers the residential sector for EQC, is currently drained down at the moment. So any new losses to EQC below or above their reinsurance level of about $2 to $6 billion is going to be absorbed by the Crown. Further, the Crown has an arrangement with local governments where they split the bill for council infrastructure following disasters 60-40. Now this was paid out in Christchurch, but for a large event that affects multiple regions, there's going to be a lot of councils coming knocking on Treasury's door. A lot of economists say that you didn't even see the Christchurch earthquakes affect New Zealand GDP. And one of the reasons for this is that people were not displaced following the events. New Zealand's service-based economy, so the knowledge economy, means that disrupting people disrupts work, disrupts jobs, disrupts the economy. So if we have an event that causes mass displacement of people, they're probably not going to want to go back to work straight away. So some of these events are going to cause downstream effects that we may have not observed in Christchurch. And while Christchurch is a really good lesson for how what we can build on from Christchurch experience, there's a few things that didn't play out. Transportation was not an issue. Christchurch geographically is easy to just bypass the CBD or the liquefied zones. Wellington, or the large East Coast earthquake, is going to cause much farther disruption to transportation, and how that then plays out into community impacts will be quite high. How we'd respond to a multi-region or New Zealand scale event, again, there's a lot of complexities there that are actually going to be played out in Exercise Tangaroa later this year. The large displaced population I mentioned, and also disruption to our primary production sector. So a volcanic event that impacts our dairy sector, that's something that could actually have quite significant downstream effects. Now, this isn't tried to be a scare story. It's really posing the challenge to how we actually then try to build, looking to the future of emergency management, how we can actually address the risks of these events. And there's lots of ways that we can do that, and I think that's going to be the challenge over the next short term. So I'd just like to acknowledge all the other institutes that fed into this type of work and for all the funders who provided the funding for this research as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but there's an urban legend, it might be true, in Wellington that when the Americans were here during the war, they offered to dig a road tunnel under the Rimatukas. Again, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but we often curse whoever was in charge of that time for not taking up the yanks on their kind offer. And it's kind of, the way I like to frame that is it was a legacy that wasn't taken up by us at the time. Again, I don't know if that's true or not. It was a good story. I guess the thing I think about today is what are the things that our grandchildren are going to moan about us about in 50 years' time, 70 years' time. And I do think that with sea level rise in particular and climate change, we have an opportunity. Yes, it's a challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity for us to get things right for our grandchildren. So I think it's vital that we don't miss that opportunity. So I'd like to invite Professor David Frame to the stage to talk to us a little bit more about that. Thanks, David. Yes.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm mainly here wearing a hat on behalf of the Deep South National Science Challenge, which is one of 11 national science challenges. We're looking to work right across a whole bunch of stuff in climate-related areas. The objective is to understand the role of the Antarctic and Southern Ocean in determining our future climate. And to do that, we've got a kind of long program that goes right from observations through climate modelling and then into the stuff that people actually care about, so the impacts of climate change and the implications for decisions. So it's a difference in terms of climate change from some of the hazards that Nick was presenting is that our impacts are much less frightening in a sense, but the probabilities are pretty close to 1 in some cases. So it's just program structure. So it's kind of a funny, the objective we have of studying the Antarctic is kind of slightly unusual in the sense that the climate system is actually driven by what happens in the tropics, but what happens in the Antarctic and Southern Ocean does matter. But New Zealanders have my experience is New Zealanders have a slightly odd view of what matters for New Zealand's climate. The Antarctic and Southern Ocean certainly matter because they can lead to things that are very bad events, but the dominant signal comes really from the tropics. And that's all driven by this little energy balance diagram, which I can talk about if anybody wants me to. The thing is, a lot of extremes come from the south, so this is why this area is of significance to us. It does govern some aspects of our climate. So this is a figure showing 3 damaging storms and their origins in the far south, but we also shouldn't forget about the north, and this is the event of a tropical cyclone remnants hitting the South Island. So these events in both. The ones from the south and the ones from the north can migrate a lot in latitude. So what we're trying to do is observe this bit down here to get a better handle on things like clouds and aerosols, which are problems for climate models. They're difficult for climate models to simulate. And also to get a better understanding of, in terms of the modelling, of the effects from the north as well, which matter at least as much. We've talked a bit about sea level rise, and unquestionably it's the one with the big asset value kind of exposed, I think, in terms of climate change. It's also a nightmare politically, because if you draw a line on a map and say below that you're affected by sea level rise and above that you don't have to worry about it so much, you create a political coalition who will die in a ditch to fight doing anything about it, because they see their asset value as having asymptoted to zero. And so I think what we have to do, and in reality, of course, the problem doesn't shake down like that. In reality, it'll be more like something like leaky homes, where there is some of the risk is private, some of the risk is public, and there's going to be a long conversation about exactly how it works. but as an issue, it's politically quite combustible. Many of the other impacts of climate change are more, they're emerging much faster than sea level rise, but they're much less severe in terms of asset value exposed anyway. So this is a little couple of slides explaining the concept of time of emergence. So a climate, in some, well, this happens to be, this is a PowerPoint figure, it's not actually a temperature plot, but it's could be any variable really, but a climate is a distribution. So that stuff's common, that stuff's unusual. And what happens with climate change is that the distributions shift over time. And so the rate at which this new distribution emerges from the old distribution under climate change is one of the things that governs, especially the exposure to what have been tail events. And the pattern of this time of emergence across the globe is really interesting because the tropical climates are pretty regular. The extratropical climates out in the storm tracts, especially continental climates, can be highly variable. So the main point here is that a relatively small shift on a narrow distribution can actually relatively be a faster emergence, be a bigger deal than in these more highly variable climates, even if you have a larger amplitude signal in the highly variable, in the extratropics. So if you look at a map of temperature change for 2100 for the world, your eye gets pulled up to the polar regions in the north and to continental interiors and places like that, because those are the ones that experience the largest magnitude of change. But if you consider the existing natural variability in the climate and you look at how those future climates compare with the climates we've had in the past, what you see is a reverse. You see a pattern in which the tropical oceans are the fastest moving parts of the climate. And that's something that people don't generally recognise. And some damages will scale off things like extreme hot days. So this is just a zonal average. So this is averaging around a latitude circle just to give you a feel for for how this shakes down around the world. But the basic point here is that the time of emergence under quite a high climate change future, and these are different models, so models do disagree. Some of the ones at the edge are probably a bit ropey, but many of the models are pretty good. What you see is that these the low latitudes, a new climate emerges, and we're using a threshold here of how many standard deviations the distribution has moved compared with its original. These climates in the tropics change very fast. The climates in the Southern Ocean are actually highly uncertain about exactly how fast they emerge from the new climate emerges from the old. But that's something that we want to get a better handle on, because that obviously matters for us, given that New Zealand spans somewhere in here. So, and as I say, the reason this stuff actually matters is because things like hot days, this is a 50-fold increase in events that would be considered extremely hot by 20th century standards. This is a paper Luke Harrington and others published last week. And this is cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide. So we've already burnt, I think, somewhere around this much carbon dioxide. So there's some parts of the world, so the tropics have already experienced a 2-fold increase in those extreme hot days. If we burn a bit more, and we don't show much sign of stopping certainly before here, we'll find it tough to stop before here in terms of how much overall carbon we burn, then anything that's kind of vaguely reddy orange will experience, then for instance here, these regions, our Pacific neighbours, would experience a 50-fold increase in hot days, well under 2 degrees of warming. So some of these, this stuff is not as politically combustible, it's not as frightening in some senses, if you're interested in asset value at risk, as sea level rise, but it's emerging much faster. So this is really, I think, the front line of climate change, and the tropics are on the front line here as well. To our south, and fairly encouragingly, this isn't emerging at this point, this is actually, it doesn't, you could have 3 degrees of warming or 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, and you still wouldn't get, and you'd still be marginal for a 10-fold increase in extreme hot days. And extreme hot days aren't a particularly severe thing in here anyway, given that it's relative to existing climate. What we're doing with Deep South, that's just to give you a bit of background on the range, some of the range of climate impacts, is we're going to be looking at extreme weather events, so especially extreme precipitation. We're going to be looking at droughts, changes in those distributional characteristics that matter for decision thresholds. So frosts, for instance, if you need, kiwi fruit growers need trees to get below some certain level, some certain temperature to get wintertime flowering. If you're a stone fruit grower, you're not so keen on frost. So we're going to look at some of those distributional properties that we know matter for decisions that people have to make. And also we're going to be deepening investment into thinking about sea level rise. It's a slightly open question about indirect impacts in areas like conservation biology or agriculture, where there are other national science challenges, so we have to work out exactly what we do there. But the idea really, and we aim to link up with these guys. We've had preliminary conversations with most of these, all of these other national science challenges. So the aim really, I think, with the national science challenges is to bring a whole bunch of research together, hopefully, to get a better handle on some of these emerging risks, which are dynamic. So things like our vulnerability to extreme to weather extremes, that's changing over time, as opposed to some of the risks which you can characterise as being fairly stable across time. So what we want to do is improve the science base and do work with various sorts of stakeholders to try and really improve New Zealand's science base and decision ability to make good decisions about climate-related events. I think that's all I wanted to say. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Look, the Ministry for the Environment doesn't exist just to protect the environment. It exists to strike a balance between New Zealand's environmental and economic strategic objectives. And we're fortunate this morning to have one of the Ministry's leading brains here to share his thoughts with us on emerging risks in the environment. So I'd like to invite David of Chittenden to the stage, please. David.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone. Hope I can live up to that. That was a bit daunting. I guess today all I want to do is talk a little bit about, well, I've been tasked with emergent risks, and I guess by their very nature, anything that's emergent is not particularly well known or understood. So I guess I want to give a bit of a feeling for how we're starting to think about this stuff. And it's probably fair to say that quite a few environmental issues have not really been thought about in a risk way before. And that, of course, presents some opportunities and some challenges. And just to be clear, I'm not actually an expert in any one of these areas, and we've been working, I guess, in conjunction with a bunch of other agencies, mainly public sector agencies. So a lot of this thinking is also being thought about in other places. And I guess we're trying to come to some kind of common framework to start to think about these things. But I'll sort of focus on the emergent aspect today. Which button are we pressing? The right one. There we go. So, first a bit of obvious risk basics. It's about uncertainty in meeting objectives. And I guess as a public policy agency, we also think about the opportunity cost of doing things. So it's not always about just managing the negative consequences. There are opportunity costs with those, and there are also opportunities in taking risks. And so we need to think a bit about leaving opportunities open where there might be reasonable risks worth taking. And obviously thinking about public policy, it's about, what are the costs and benefits relative, how do they fall over time, how do they fall on different kinds of parties. The other part, I guess, is, if you're that person there, so, how do you know what to do? So we obviously, the first thing we do is we kind of fall into some kind of risk assessment. And that obviously has a component of science, and we've heard some good science, as well as perception. And anyone who's afraid of heights will know how strong that perception will actually influence what that guy's going to do, taking an opportunity or retreating. So obviously we think about risk in that traditional way of likelihood and consequence, and then you bring in all those factors around vulnerability and exposure, etc. So now I'd just like to talk a little bit about, I guess, some of the terms that we're trying to think about risk and, I guess, the real world and how that might affect a sort of a more traditional risk management approach. So the first is shocks, and obviously those are not necessarily just unique to the environment. We know what a shock feels like. They're sudden, they're disruptive, they're usually quite negative. So in terms of the environment, obviously sort of an earthquake or a tsunami is a good example of a shock. Then we have stresses, which tend to be sort of long-term, chronic, also usually negative. So in the environment, we might think of kind of diffuse pollution sources over a long period of time stressing a particular environment or ecosystem. And then there are, of course, all these other things, of which Joe talked about quite a few, these system trends that are going on out there, which may positively or negatively affect how we see a risk, and might not be anything to do with the environment, of course. So demographic change in a population will obviously have an influence on the vulnerability of people to a particular risk. So just trying to think about what's emerging and what's environment. So this is just out of my own head, but I guess emerging I'm kind of categorizing as stuff today that is either poorly understood, or maybe it's very well understood but only by a few experts, and or poorly managed. So I guess here I wasn't thinking about things like air quality and water quality and some of the contaminated land things. We could, of course, argue whether those are very well managed or not, but at least there are quite a lot of systems and players and policies in place and changes going on to try and manage those. If we think about the environment, obviously we have sort of these, what we consider external sort of threats, tsunamis, earthquakes, etc., things that seem to appear in the environment and then just come and affect us. But often we're also talking about things like climate change that it gets considered as an environmental issue. And obviously that's actually caused by humans from sort of diffuse or cumulative effects from humans. It's probably also worth noting that the World Economic Forum, many of you might be aware, they publish I think it's an annual report on global risks. And they have a sort of environmental category which includes things like oil spills. They sort of treat man-made environmental catastrophes as an environmental thing. I guess we would treat that more as a technological issue. It obviously has massive impacts on the environment, but that's a distinction we're making. And obviously we're interested about those things that are actually going to have major effects, not things that aren't. So that's another area to just kind of frame our focus. So some of this is not necessarily peculiar to the environment, but it is absolutely core. So obviously environments, you're not supposed to read that, are made up of huge numbers of parts, very complex systems. You know, there are often lots of feedback loops, there are sort of buffers and lags. And so, you know, if you're thinking about system dynamics in terms of behavior, you get obviously a lot of nonlinear behavior, you get discontinuities, those kinds of things. And obviously irreversible effects can be a big part of the environment. So you can take an environment from one sort of dynamic equilibrium stable point to flip it to another. And I guess the big thing for thinking about environmental things, therefore, is, you know, to coin it very loosely, the future is not going to be like the past. So this provides a really big problem for the traditional risk approach, particularly your quantitative kinds of risk assessments. And where often you have, for earthquakes, there's some kind of statistical historical basis which provides some bounds, and we can project that stuff into the future around the likelihood. Obviously, the consequences will change. With some of the environmental stuff, particularly the emerging stuff, and like climate change, that's just not the case. So it provides unique challenges. So some very initial thinking, going back to that sort of typology I put up earlier. So in terms of system trends from the environment, we're really thinking about sort of two major ones. Climate change, which is obviously well talked about now, and sort of a general level of environmental degradation. I probably should have mentioned earlier too that obviously a system trend could actually manifest itself and change into a shock or a stress. So those things aren't ever going to just stay as they are. And as David was just talking about for climate change, that's going to produce some very real sort of shocks and stresses that will merge out of such a system trend. So here's a kind of a loose list of categories, I guess, that we're thinking about, some emerging risks from the environment. Maybe I'll talk about the bottom two first, not my areas of expertise, as I said. You know, meteorite impacts, obviously there is a historical record, and for New Zealand as well. I think it was only a couple of years ago that a meteorite went through an Auckland house roof and landed on the couch, a small one, obviously. But we tend not to have any management approach for those impacts, and we tend to rely on NASA to track objects, and from my understanding, we don't do too much more than that. For the geomagnetic storms from the sun, obviously they also have a long statistical basis. Whether we know about that very much or not is another question. But I think the big factor with that is, and Joe talked about the rise of all the of technology in particular, particularly the internet-based stuff. You know, geomagnetic storms could have a major impact on those kinds of systems. For the other three there, obviously they're still huge areas. They're huge topics in themselves, each one of them. They'll depend on which ecosystem we're talking about, which resource we're talking about, and which kind of species we're talking about. And obviously those will change depending on which area you're talking about and what kinds of time frames. So as I said, this is kind of initial thinking. I guess one way that we've been thinking about, the reason I've put service in there in brackets is trying to distinguish between sort of biodiversity loss affecting ecosystems, as well as what are the real core things that we have that we rely on. So ecosystem services, such things as healthy soil, or the provision of healthy soil from the environment, provision of healthy water, clean air, all those kinds of things. Just a note on the precautionary principle. So, you know, that's been around for a while, and it was really sort of coined as a guideline for where there is scientific uncertainty to provide sort of a basis for action to at least prevent irreversible harm. In Sir Peter Gluckman's recent paper, who's obviously the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, he also made a comment about the precautionary principle and how it's used, and suggests that it's kind of being misused in some places, and I guess this is where we come to the opportunity cost, particularly around the adoption of new technologies, where, you know, a lot of people take the precautionary principle as something that is to be adhered to until there is some kind of mythical 100% scientific certainty that something is safe, and obviously that's not possible. So, and you know, the precautionary principle is embedded in a number of kind of statutory instruments as well. So, you know, we do have to watch how we use that, and who are the appropriate kinds of decision makers to use it. So just a couple of small examples. Thinking about major biodiversity loss. So just as an example of that, I said it's a wide topic. It really depends on much more specific areas. So this is, on the left there, I hope it's an accurate picture. It's supposed to be a subtidal seagrass meadow which exists in the Kaipara Harbour. And that is the only place in the west coast of the North Island that is the nursery ground for 80% of the snapper stocks between 90 Mile Beach and the Kapiti coast. And it's already under pressure from sedimentation. So, if we have a kind of event like a cyclone bowler in the area, and depending on what happens with land use around agriculture and forestry, obviously you could get a major dose of sedimentation into such a meadow, and obviously the consequences for that would be massive for the snapper fishery, economically, culturally for Kaimoana, recreational fishing, and also obviously the flow-on effects into the wider ecosystem, but also the water quality stuff. So just sort of an example of part of that. One way we can think about major biodiversity loss. Obviously there would be a lot more areas that would need investigation to kind of get a handle on where the biggest risks occur. And then I'm not really going to talk about this too much because it's already been mentioned, and I actually think the fact that it's already been mentioned by so many people is a really great thing, because it shows that it's not so much emerging anymore. I guess it's kind of interesting that the government has certainly done a lot of work in the past on working out what is the cost to the economy on trying to mitigate our emissions over a certain time frame. But I think, as David Frame was talking about, we still don't really have good ideas about what those impacts might be right across New Zealand. We obviously have some areas, and we've talked about sea level rise and the exacerbating contribution that climate change has to coastal and weather-related hazards. But exactly how much and by when is really the uncertainty. As David said, the likelihood is, of course, very high, probably close to 1. But how far and how fast that goes is where the uncertainty lies. And then obviously affecting our Pacific neighbours, low-lying areas, is going to produce pressures on for sort of climate migrants, and New Zealand will obviously be expected to play a part there. The distribution and emergence of new types of pests and diseases will obviously be a part of that. So I haven't included pests and diseases here as an emerging issue, because we do have quite good systems to manage those, but obviously there will be new ones that will constantly challenge our systems, and climate change will affect those. That was it.
Thanks, David. Look, Christchurch, like Wellington, is part of the 100 Resilient Cities network of Rockefeller's pioneering. I was down in Christchurch just before Christmas with them talking about resilience, and we had a whole bunch of people there from NZTA, from Public Health and other agencies, and we were just kind of doing a sanity check to make sure that Christchurch hadn't missed the key things that could make a difference to the shocks and stresses that were confronting Christchurch. And we went around the table, and it came to the woman from Public Health, and she looked around the table at us, mostly men in our 50s, I have to say, and she said, if there's one thing we can do to prevent health becoming a stress for Christchurch, she said, don't get type 2 diabetes. For her, that was the one thing that we could do, mostly as 50-year-old men, but to prevent a stress on the health system. So that was enlightening to me, but for someone who knows far more about it and who was recently voted as having the finest beard in the public sector, I'd like to introduce Charles Blanch. Thanks, Charles.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all. So, conscious of the risk of deep vein thrombosis, and you've all been sat there for an hour, I only did slides for 10 minutes, so if people just want to stand up and just shake out for 30 seconds, and then I'll carry on with my talk. Okay, and if you want to take a seat and we'll get started again. I thought about inflicting some group calisthenics on you, but resisted the temptation. Thanks to the previous speaker, David, for introducing some of the concepts around shocks, stresses, and system trends. It means I don't need to cover those definitions. What I want to do is talk about some risks. In all honesty, they're probably not emerging. They're things that are aware to people and we're starting to talk about within the system. Some of them are very obvious, others are less obvious, but I can promise you that I think all of them will affect you within your lifetimes, and they'll certainly affect our children and grandchildren. So, moving on to the most obvious one, which is pandemic influenza. It's the area that the health sector is the lead agency for within the national security system. And it's something we've experienced before in New Zealand in 1918, 1957, 1968, and 2009. 2009 was the H1N1 pandemic that emerged out of pigs, and perhaps did us a disservice with some parts of society where there was a bit of perhaps a sentiment that it wasn't that big an event in the end. Well, we certainly still had intensive care units at nearly 200% capacity and a huge load on the primary care sector, but we were fortunate that it didn't feature the case fatality rate that we're planning for and didn't result in nearly 35,000 excess deaths in 2009 and 2010. Because that's the number that we've got within the New Zealand Pandemic Action Plan. We based it around a pandemic wave impacting 1.6 million people in the first wave and becoming ill over an 8-week period. Subsequent waves, until we get an effective vaccine and we're part of the global system in terms of the wait for that vaccine, means that probably the entire population will become infected at some point. And in week 5, it would peak with illness and absenteeism at around 25%. That's not 25% in the public sector, that's 25% across all sectors. So we're talking a massive system-wide business continuity impact that will need to be managed. And it's not just New Zealand managing it in isolation. It's all of our global links, all of our dependencies on other countries that will be going through it at the same time. So crudely, 2006 Treasury did some modelling and depending on the exact severity, predicted a GDP impact of 10 to 20%. And those losses total $15 to $30 billion in the first year and up to $25 to $40 billion over 4 years that the pandemic's likely to run. It hasn't gone away, and World Health Organization is monitoring a number of so-called HXs and NYs, different variations of influenza that we've got no natural immunity to anymore. Closely linked to that is an area around what we call emerging infectious diseases. So these are either diseases that are from the past and we've not seen previous, and we think they've been dealt with, but they're starting to re-emerge because of changes in practice, or they're diseases like we saw with the West Africa Ebola outbreak that have typically occurred on the urban-rural fringe, and as people have moved further into the bush, as they've undertaken intensive logging, intensive urbanization, as road networks have improved across Africa 20 years after a spate of civil wars, those diseases have been able to move across countries and continents with much greater rapidity. Challenges in some parts of the global system is chronic underinvestment in the healthcare system. So whilst the challenge in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea were severe, Save the Children in a report last year identified that there were 28 countries that actually spent less money per person on healthcare than Liberia did. So those countries have even less of a public health surveillance system, even less of an acute and tertiary hospital capacity to respond to those kinds of emerging infectious diseases. And it's not just a problem for other people. Those of you who don't know what this is a drying rack for boots and gloves at Hastings Airfield, which is the Ebola treatment centre that Australian and New Zealand government funded through Aspen Medical. So global health security is everyone's problem. We saw the challenges across media and other stakeholders with imported cases of Ebola in other high-income countries. But it's worth noting that responding to the outbreak in West Africa, as of March 2015, so not even at the end of the response, had already cost globally 3 times what it would have cost to provide comprehensive healthcare settings in those vulnerable countries. And we were fortunate really that it was contained to those countries and that we didn't see a significant outbreak, say in Lagos with 6 million people and much greater global connections. And that was largely as a result of international efforts to strengthen the public health surveillance capability, the clinical capacity, but also strengthen core capacity to detect those diseases in neighboring countries. But Ebola wasn't just affecting the other part of the world. It, as you know, had a pretty big impact on New Zealand. So we found ourselves having to find novel ways of solving problems and some great partnership between the NGO sector with St. John Ambulance and our colleagues in New Zealand Defence Force. You know, how do we manage a suspect, highly infectious patient who comes back to New Zealand when we've got no need normally in day-to-day business for moving infectious patients around the country? The system's pretty good at managing some of these oddballs, but they're going to get greater, I think, as we go forward. You might have heard a bit about these little blighters, Aegis aegypti. So when we were providing briefings across government agencies 18 months ago, we were trying to set the message, yes, we're thinking about Ebola at the moment, but we're still really worried about pandemic influenza, but we're also worried about some of these other emerging infectious diseases, especially the impact of vector-borne diseases like dengue, chikungunya, and what was a footnote at the time, Zika virus. Fast forward a year later and before Christmas, we were getting dragged into watch groups and briefings to senior officials on just what Zika virus meant. And we were trying to provide that advice with a very incomplete epidemiological picture on just who was at risk. And the stakeholders involved were massive and varied. Everything from the New Zealand Olympic team on what we should be telling athletes, competitors, and visitors going with them, returning tourists, New Zealand government officials stationed overseas for a range of agencies in areas where this vector was present. But again, it's not just New Zealanders going offshore or heading offshore, it's when they come back. So currently we have 86 confirmed cases and 5 probable cases of Zika virus, and we'll be maintaining those studies and follow up to see what the long-term consequences of those cases are. But Fiji, Samoa, American Samoa, and Tonga are all reporting local spread of Zika virus, and they all have that vector Aegis aegypti present. So one of our concerns is that surveillance and interdiction monitoring at the border in conjunction with Ministry of Primary Industry, but what we don't want is a credible vector for some of these emerging infectious diseases to become established within New Zealand. Australia has that challenge, and they have Aegis aegypti established in the far north of Queensland, and we certainly don't want it in New Zealand. Other things we're interested in, things like peak oil. So with a just-in-time supply chain, what's the effect of the container ship transporting medical supplies, consumables, widgets, anything else from China? Instead of arriving here in 20 days, they sail at half speed and they arrive here in 40 days. Well, roughly across the board, we probably have about 3 months of wholesale supply medicines in our warehouses, but it's a pretty complex area and one that we probably don't know enough about. We've got greater stockpile in certain categories. We did some work to enhance the amount of pandemic antibiotics we hold, but I suspect there's other areas that are just as critical. We've seen events this year like the Japan Kumamoto earthquake earlier. That's had a massive impact, not just on large manufacturers like Sony and Toyota, but on all of the component manufacturers. So the company manufacturing the control chip that goes into a generic ABS braking system that's fitted into 3 different manufacturers' cars. And we only hear about it when my colleague at work complains about the fact that his new motorcycle's being delayed 6 months from Honda. But what are the other issues that might be caught up in that in the future? I commend this book to you. It's a very short read. It's about 60 pages. Dame Sally Davies is a Chief Medical Officer for the UK. And she talks about the challenge of antimicrobial resistance and starts the book with a pretty dire scenario, 2043, and somebody dying at home in isolation from the common cold, and a world where things like elective surgery simply isn't conducted anymore because of the risks of post-operative infections. Currently, 25,000 people a year across Europe die of resistant infections, and that's the same number as a road toll. Antibiotics have been with us since 1932, and since that period, 20 major classes have been developed. But the last major class was discovered in 1987 and introduced into clinical use in 2001. And we're already seeing antibiotics reserved as drugs of last resort for a range of resistant organisms. So we're certainly losing the battle against infectious diseases at the moment, and they're becoming more resistant to modern medicine. As she says, the drugs don't work. The issues that are driving this is variations in prescribing practice. In some countries, you can obtain antibiotics over the counter at the pharmacy, and we know that many people fail to complete their prescription courses. All that does is allow the resistant bacteria to survive and multiply. There's also a massive challenge with the role of antibiotics in the agricultural sector, where they're used prophylactically to increase the speed of growth of animals for slaughter. So what are the answers to this? Well, she proposes 3 areas: enhanced infection prevention control across social settings and within the healthcare sector, revising our framework for prescribing, basically using antibiotics for what they're needed for, and incentivizing the research market to try and find new classes of antibiotics and make them financially viable for pharmaceutical to bring to market. And finally, picking up from some of David's points, climate change adaptation. So for New Zealand in the short term, we're likely to see more severe and disruptive severe weather events. That might have an acute impact on somebody needing to get to hospital during that event. It might have an impact on individual and direct loss of life within that event. But we're certainly going to see it with our response into the South Pacific and some of our closest neighbours. And the shot there is from Tropical Cyclone Winston, and you've got 3 government agencies, New Zealand Defence Force, 2 district health boards, and New Zealand Fire Service logisticians support to the medical team working together to deliver medical effect on Coral Island. But we know that climate change adaptation is going to make it even more likely that those blighters I talked about find New Zealand a palatable place to live. And we know that there's a range of countries in the Pacific, Kiribati, our protectorates within Tuvalu, that are at significant risk of sea level rise. And I think within our generation, we're going to see challenges around migration and absorption of people displaced from their homes within the South Pacific. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. Look, when we do get in the shit, the first people who always show up at our shoulders are the Aussies. And we're lucky enough to have an Aussie today to help talk to us about hazards, risks and resilience. So from the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, please welcome Richard Thornton. Thanks, Richard. Cheers.
I'm going to try and stay on safe ground and not mention anything to do with sport, because that's the one time we don't agree. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges. I was given 10 to 15 minutes to talk about everything that was happening in Australia, and I think I might struggle to do that in 10 minutes. So I'm going to focus on 3 core messages at the end, which is about where I guess the national debate is in Australia. We have all of the hazards, all of the issues that you've just heard from that New Zealand has. We have another hazard that comes to play because we have states. And the introduction of states into the whole mix makes the whole emergency management sector really difficult in Australia. It leads to a whole load of responsibility and accountability problems and funding issues. And I will just pick up on one. We saw a nice picture of a black swan up there. It's an interesting metaphor because Australia has a lot of black swans. I don't know whether that says something about our hazard space or whether we just need a different analogy. But I'm just going to quickly do something that's a bit of advertising just so that you're aware of it. Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC is a research centre that's funded by the Commonwealth Government through its Cooperative Research Centre scheme. We have roughly 47 million from the Commonwealth over 8 years and total funds of about 130 million when you add in the cash and in kind from our other partners. We have roughly 50 partners, and that includes the New Zealand Fire Service across the whole of Australia, so all states and territories, Commonwealth Government. We have lots of universities and research organisations involved. And what we're aiming to do is deal with the national issues, look at the large-scale problems that are out there. We're very much multi-hazard, although it says bushfire and natural hazards. That was a prime ministerial name about 4 prime ministers ago, which coincidentally was only 3 years. We're about to have we may have another one in another month. We're very much a multi-hazard, so in our scope, that's primarily sudden onset hazard. We are trying to fill gaps in knowledge. We're not trying to solve the politics of the problem, because that's an intractable problem. We're looking for a sizable impact, and importantly, our research is focused on how well can it get used. So it's at the core of everything we do. The research problems are set by our end user bases. The research is conducted by our research organisations in conjunction with teams that include end users. And at the end of the day, every project has an adoption route into an end user. So that's just a quick ad. If you go to our website, all of our stuff is online. So anything that you want is there, and it's online, free to anyone. So it's a resource for New Zealand as well as Australia. I guess the core of our research program is about the disaster resilient Australia. Australia's had a national strategy for disaster resilience, and I'll touch on that since about 2009, 2010. And that's driven a lot of what happens in and around Australia. We also include a whole lot of the different sectors in our work, so not just the fire and emergency services, so the response agencies, but also the policy, the land management issues, and from all states and territories, and a bunch of not-for-profit organisations like Red Cross and others who have a strong interest in the recovery side. We've got a few hazards. We've got one of each, and I've missed out space weather. I should have mentioned space weather in there as well. Our biggest hazard by cost is storm. So hailstorm and those types of things is still our biggest hazard. It accounts for something like 40–50% of the insurance losses in Australia. That's because Brisbane and Sydney get hammered by hailstorms. And the Sydney hailstorm in 1980s, whatever it was one of our biggest events. Clearly, the big ticket items everybody sees in Australia is cyclone, strong winds, large wildfires, bushfires. They are mainly an issue in the south of the country, but the north of the country has repeated annual cycles of fire, and that is actually used as a carbon abatement environmental issue up there as well. Clearly we have riverine flooding, we have flash flooding, we have storm surge and tsunami risks. We've got a big coastline. We do actually have an earthquake risk, and that comes as a surprise to most of the people in Australia, but it's still, particularly South Australia, Adelaide was constructed about the same time as Christchurch with the same city planners, same basic designs, sits on a fault, which is overdue. Sydney also has an earthquake risk, and nothing is built to any code. So there's an issue there. Landslip and heat wave, and I'll touch on heat wave in a moment, but heat wave is Australia's biggest killer from a hazard perspective. Let me just talk about some of the drivers that are driving, I guess, the debate in Australia. Demographics. Australia's got a growing population. It's predicted to increase by about 50% by about 2055 or thereabouts. we've got to find somewhere for half the population of Australia to live again. So that leads to increased urbanisation, densification of cities. It leads to people living in higher risk areas. Alongside that, we're seeing an ageing population as well, so we've got a higher vulnerability of the communities. And we're seeing large waves of new migrants, whether they're refugees or migrants coming in, who don't understand the risks in Australia. The number of drownings we have at the beach from tourists coming in, not understanding that calm bit of water out there isn't calm because it's a nice bit to swim in, but that's the rip. Don't go in there. That's a growing problem. We also have a problem with settling of people from war-torn areas where somebody in a uniform knocking on the door to do community education means something very different where they came from. So those sorts of issues can become a problem. The cost of disasters is clearly driving a lot of what's happening here, and there are various figures. There's two really good reports that I'd point you to if you're really interested in the economics of disasters. Both are done by the Australian Business Roundtable for Community Safety. One puts the economic cost of disasters at the moment in Australia at $6 billion a year. This one, which is just came out recently, adds in social costs, and that doubles the figure. And you can see it's only getting worse into the future. That analysis doesn't include climate change, because they wanted to get the message across to government, and in Australia you don't talk about climate change. I'm not in Australia, so I'll talk about climate change. Climate change is clearly driving a lot of what we're going to be doing into the future. The issue of heat waves is becoming considerably more an issue, particularly driving overnight temperatures higher, and it's the overnight temperatures that lead to deaths. People can't recover from the heat. And it's not just the peak heats, it's a heat above normal. So Australia now has an index that the Bureau of Meteorology uses for heat wave, that we now at least can forecast some of that. Underpinning this is also drought, and the effect of the climate variability with El Nino can be critical, and we saw that this year with the Tasmanian bushfires. The areas that they burnt only burn very, very rarely. Dry lightning events that started those are virtually unknown in Tasmania. We had 50 fires overnight started by one storm. That's going to become more of an issue. The fact that we also had floods on the east coast while we had fires on the west coast of Tasmania is also unknown. So we're going into the unknown unknowns from climate change. And we're also seeing major events coming closer together. Just briefly, we've had the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience that has been in place now since 2010, roughly, is being re-looked at now because actually one of the challenges with this document is it doesn't actually have any measures. And that's a bit of an issue because how do you actually work out what it is? And that becomes difficult to be able to report against or drive action. One of the major things and the discussion points has changed, particularly at senior levels within most of the response agencies and emergency management planning areas in Australia. The view that catastrophic events are inevitable. What that does, and you can see this, that's just insurance losses. One of the important things to remember is different hazards have different impacts. Sometimes they show up in insurance figures and sometimes they don't. Floods are a case in point because a lot of the time they're washing away roads, and that's public costs and not private costs, which insurance picks up. But once you start to acknowledge the fact that major events are inevitable, you remove the whole discussion about likelihood. And we heard a number of comments today about the 1 in 100 year event or whatever. That terminology of 1 in 100 year event is what stops the communities doing anything, because they think I've got another 99 years after an event. So once you start to start that conversation about catastrophic events are inevitable, there is a point where every government, every agency will fail, then you have a different conversation happening in terms of events. So what does that actually mean? And I'm going to leave you with three thought processes. The first is disaster resilience is critical. If you believe that events are always going to happen, then you've got to move to make your communities more resilient. And that also applies to your critical infrastructure. That applies to your businesses and business continuity issues. Whether it's the banking systems to get recovery money out post-event, whether it's the infrastructures and cascading issues around infrastructure, and particularly critical infrastructure, is a big issue. Risk ownership becomes a debate that then happens, and the piece of work that we've been doing basically says that something like 50 or 60% of the risks that are out there are not owned by anybody and therefore not managed. So we need to identify that. Disaster resilience is a critical part of how we move forwards. The next bit is about connectedness. And a critical step in that resilience agenda, whether it's the Resilient Cities Initiative that Melbourne and Sydney and Christchurch, Wellington are part of, is good. And what it talks about is connectedness. It's about how do we connect all of the public offices, every single department in government, and in our case that's up and down state, territory, Commonwealth and local government. In Victoria, they've come up with a tagline, if you like, that we work as one. And that's because they established an Office of Emergency Management which cuts across the whole of government, cuts across the whole of the private sector, has a critical infrastructure resilience strategy that talks about how do we deal with the cascading problems that occur. If you lose power, then you lose a lot of other pieces of critical infrastructure. We had a small fire in a telephone exchange in a small country town on the coast in Victoria a few years ago, and that impacted on the health sector because they couldn't get prescriptions through. They couldn't get the pages to work for the emergency services. You couldn't call anybody, you couldn't talk to anybody. So it was a huge cascading issue. Connectedness is the core to resilience. And finally, the last point I want to leave you with is mitigation. And it goes without saying that mitigation is always better than response and recovery. We don't just mean mitigation in terms of not incurring the costs, we mean the pain and suffering that occurs with the event. So mitigation, by definition, is always better than response and recovery. It just happens to also be cheaper. There was a Productivity Commission review on the way that disaster funding is done in Australia that basically said mitigation is the key to this, and that we can save some of that $6 billion, at least a 1 to 7 return on the mitigation dollar against recovery dollar. There are some problems though. We, in our disaster recovery funding, have a betterment provision. The Productivity Commission could only find one example over how many years it ever studied where it's actually been used. And ironically, it was to move a swimming pool out of a flood zone. So it's a bit of a challenge. There are a whole load of challenges that sit in this space. The focus on inevitability means all of our agencies, and particularly some of the ones that are leading this debate, are now focusing on managing consequence as opposed to managing likelihood. What that means is having pre-existing consequence management plans to an event. That means that you can mitigate a lot of those consequences early rather than later. So if you're already looking through the event to the recovery, then you can start to do that. There are still a lot of issues with making mitigation happen, and I don't know where it sits in New Zealand. Politics and political capital are a key to it. Politicians get a lot of political capital out of handing out money post-event and standing on roundabouts and saying we're going to rebuild. We really would like people to rebuild better, or probably not at all in some places. But that gains political capital. As soon as the political masters in this place or the public sector start to say, we want you, the community, to do something to help yourself, that erodes political capital pretty quickly. We saw that in Sandy in New York as well. So that cuts across a whole lot of those things. Funding anomalies are a problem. In Australia, the funding for recovery comes from the federal government. Most of the mitigation spending has to be done at the local government. Funding for recovery is a contingent liability in the government's budgets. That means that you can't count savings against that. So if you want to do mitigation, it's new money in the budget you've got to find savings for, and timing becomes a problem because you have an issue with you spend mitigation money today, but you're still incurring the recovery costs moving forwards. So we're a resource that you all can use. Go to our website, sign up for the hazard news, hazard notes, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Happy to engage in the debate. That's what we're here for, to answer questions. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're into lunchtime, so I'm just going to quickly deal with these questions. Over now? Okay. All right, so we'll just take 6 minutes, okay, to do the leading questions. But the first two, I have to say, I don't believe are questions actually for the panel. So the first two questions are about, given a 3-year political cycle, how do we lock in long-term risk management evolution? I want to suggest that I pose that question rather than to the panel, that I pose it to the Director of the Ministry and ask her to deal with that in plenary or in her sum-up discussion. So hopefully everyone's genuinely okay with that. And actually I was going to recommend the same for the second one, where we've kind of talked about these worst case scenarios. And sitting here all morning, if you're a layperson, you would have the crap scared out of you by what you've just heard. So if everyone's genuinely okay with it, I want to pose those first two questions to Norm and get her to answer those in plenary. But Joe, the next most popular question is indeed aimed at you. So would you care to respond to that, which is your observation that increasing economic divides are our biggest risk? How do those you have been working with see this playing out if the current policy settings continue?
I ever read one from a political point of view. I think that the way that I see it is New Zealand's political divide's actually pretty narrow. On the political spectrum, we kind of veer slightly this way and we veer slightly that way. And you've seen increasing focus from both political parties on social issues moving forward. I think the real issue is not so much from a social development point of view, but from an education and data skills and access point of view. And the policy settings around that. There are opportunities that the data analysis gives around better targeting, but there's also issues around people who have a lack of access to what's now called data capital moving forward. So the way that I would see the issue playing out in the current era is that we're going to end up with a diminishing number of what were traditionally called blue-collar jobs and a difficulty in finding employment for those people unless we can address that through our education system. And at the end of the day, that's where the issue is going to be resolved.
Thank you very much, Joe. Nick, can I pose the next one to you, please? If tourism is New Zealand's largest international trade, how would these events, such as an alpine fault movement, affect long-term tourism and the New Zealand economy?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and when we look at tourism, there's probably two things to play out. There's one, the tourists are actually very vulnerable people to natural hazard events. They often haven't been educated like New Zealanders have in the actions, say post-earthquake drop cover hold or around tsunami evacuation. So it makes them more vulnerable directly to events, but they also don't have the community safety net behind them. So when an event happens, they need more help than other parts of the community. A lot of South Island towns rely on tourism, and so the impact is going to be higher on those that are affected. There's some excellent work being done out of Otago University by Caroline Orstiston, who is probably in a better position to answer that. She's not here at the moment, but I would suggest maybe following up on some of her work.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Look, so the PowerPoint slides and a full video of this session will be available from next week, presumably on the MECDEM website. Thank you. And just time for one more, I guess David, or either David, around climate change and the risk of drought in New Zealand.
I'd like to Sam Bean is actually in the audience. He's NEMA's chief scientist. So Sam, maybe you can answer that?
Well, we don't know the answer, but presumably the risk profile changes as the climate changes. You would think so, yeah. All right, I think I'll draw it to a close there. For the other ones, I'm sure that the panel members won't mind if you would like to grab them over lunch and have a chat with them about those other questions. But can I just ask you finally to put your hands together, please, for the panel. Thank you very much.